As chair of the Global Justice Working Group, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Senator Kim Pate. She's the mother of Michael and Madison, and she graduated from Dalhousie Law School in 1984. From 1992 to her appointment as senator in 2016, she was the executive director of the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Society, where she worked in coalition with Aboriginal women and many other disadvantaged women. Prior to that, she worked with youth and men at John Howard Society in Calgary, as well as at the national office. She is a member of the Order of Canada and the recipient of several very important awards, and she has 6 honorary doctorates. She's also promoter of the Guaranteed Income Initiative. Thank you, Senator Kim Pate, for accepting my invitation to speak here.
Oh, thank you very much for that generous introduction, Anita. And please do everybody refer to me as Kim. And it's a humbling honor to be invited to join you. I join you as I think we all are on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg along the Kitchissippi River, otherwise known as the Ottawa River. And I also want to thank you and your congregation for the incredible support. You may not even be aware of the support you've provided over the years to members of my family, including most recently my mother, who was attending day programs as she struggled, and we moved through some of the stages of her dementia. And in fact, the reason I have to leave at 10:15 is I have scheduled calls with her. She's in a care home now, and the only way for the last 3 months we've been able to communicate with her is through Skype calls. And so that's the reason I'm leaving at 10:15, not because I wouldn't otherwise want to spend the time with you. So thank you very much, and for all of the work you do, for the incredible contributions made to the community. I've been asked to speak a bit about what's happened in the prisons with the pandemic. As we know, this pandemic has laid bare the incredible inequalities that exist in our country and our communities, in the world, really, and not just the economic inequality, the health inequality, but also, as we're seeing from the demonstrations around the world in support of Black Lives Matter and others, the incredible racist discrimination. And what does that have to do with prisons? Well, what we're seeing in a macro level in our institution, or in the world, is what we see in a micro level in the institutions. Over generations, and certainly over the past 30 years, the prisons in our country and in other countries around the world have become literally the last place, the only place that cannot refuse individuals, cannot turn them away because they don't fit the mandate, cannot identify that there are no rooms, any of those things. And so we've seen literally individuals who have faced discrimination, who have not had support, increasingly being relegated to the streets, to death, or to prisons. And that's part of how we end up with a situation where, as we're talking today, 42% of women in federal custody are Indigenous, 11% are Black. When we talk about men, the numbers are slightly less, the numbers overall are greater in terms of the number of men in prison. The percentages are less. About 30% of men are Indigenous, and about 8-9% are Black. But the reality is, and when we look at the intersections of those discriminations, for instance, when we look at youth, in places like Saskatchewan, where I was recently working and still am working on some matters, 98% of the girls and young women in custody are Indigenous. We don't end up in that place because they are the people who cause the greatest harm in our communities. We end up in that place because of intersections of discrimination and privileging of certain perspectives over years. It is not accidental either that when the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry put forth its calls for justice, that in fact they go right from birth to death, essentially, to talk about how, in fact, it is those levels of discrimination that have rendered Indigenous women, other racialized women, most likely to end up either in child welfare system, in juvenile custody, on the streets, in prisons, or dead, and missing or disappeared. And so when we start with that, not a big surprise that when the pandemic hit, one of the first things that many of us were concerned about, in fact, the first statement we made in our office about it was March 13th, which coincidentally was also the last time I was able to visit my mom. And many people have drawn the comparisons between what we are facing in terms of limited, physical distancing, limited ability to move around and to congregate and associate with prison. And I want to encourage people to, if that allows you a glimpse of understanding, that's great. But please, nobody be fooled that in what we have experienced is anything remotely resembling what it would be like to be locked in prison during this time. The isolation, the lack of access to any kind of resources, services, programs, people, other than those who are responsible for keeping you locked up, for counting you, is very different from the reality we are facing. The inability to pick up a phone, to look at or distance and Zoom or interact by FaceTime or any of the other methods that we have available to interact are non-existent. We know the long-term impacts from the last few decades of research of isolation, the neurological, psychological, and the physical impacts of isolation. We have the ability to do some of that moving around in most cases, although there are certainly members of our community, people who live in public housing, people who are, in all kinds of reasons, don't have the same opportunity to move around, to be able to physically distance in their homes or in their communities because of the limits of their the resources available to them, particularly economic resources, don't have the same ability to have the nutritious food that many of us are still able to access, even though we may be in isolation. So what this pandemic has really clarified is the extent to which that the levels of discrimination impact those who have the least. And when we talk about prisons, one of the things we know is that 1/4 of the people who are in our prisons right now are individuals who are classified as in the vulnerable category of older. So that's one. 1 in 7 are in the category of compromised health situations that we were supposed to be really concerned and making sure we're dealt with. We also know that many, in fact thousands, were within days, weeks, or months of release when the pandemic hit. And in fact, the last count I have from the parole board is that 110 people who were actually released by the parole board or were deemed to be or are supposed to be being released into the community have not been released as a result of some of the measures that have been taken during the pandemic. So we have a situation where when health professionals, in fact, there were 150 health professionals, not just folks like me and lawyers and others in the community, but 150 doctors and nurses and other health professionals who wrote to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health and said that one of the first priorities that the government should have when it came to prisoners should be depopulating or reducing the numbers of people in prison for two main reasons. One, that the ability to follow the physical distancing rules, the ability to engage the hygiene practices that all of us are being encouraged to do, who aren't locked in institutions, are much more difficult to do in a prison setting. And the result is people are subject to essentially solitary confinement or segregation throughout these past 3 months, because that is one of the key ways to keep people isolated, and so entire prisons, including people who are minimum security prisoners, are in lockdown. And the other is that if in fact outbreaks happen, as we now know, for at least 4 prisons have had significant outbreaks, the risk to the healthcare system in small communities where many of these penitentiaries and prisons exist means that prisons could also become vectors for further spread. And so I know from the calls that I've received that there are many people within the prison system who themselves were calling for this, but were being silenced, whether it is people working on the front lines as officers, pastors, doctors, nurses, even senior people as high as the wardens. But because it was not seen as the preferred approach, whether it was because of the government's position or whether it was because of a perception of how the public would receive this, those kinds of approaches were not prioritized. Minister Blair did, in response to questions that were asked when he appeared in the Senate in late March, did indicate that he was asking the Commissioner of Corrections and the head of the chair of the Parole Board of Canada to come up with plans for reducing the numbers of people in prison. And I see recently he has announced that we're now approximately 700 people fewer in federal penitentiaries right now than there were this time last year. That's good news, but the problem seems to be, and we still haven't got the full answer from this, we've been asking for it, is some of that is because some provinces and territories took the position very early on. Ontario, interestingly, was one of them that very early on decided to do a few things like try and limit the number of people coming into the prisons by really promoting additional bail programs and programs to keep people in the community rather than put them into remand centers. Also, in many jurisdictions, those serving intermittent sentences, so people who would normally serve their sentences on the weekend and were working in the community or taking care of a family in the community during the week, were permitted to stay under house arrest on the weekends instead of going into penitentiaries. These were individuals who were perceived as not a risk to public safety because obviously if they were given an intermittent sentence, they were in the community most of the time and only in prison on the weekends. And so those numbers may be, the 700 fewer, may be attributable to the fact that fewer people have been coming into the prison system. We don't know for certain, but also it would coincide with a number of the court systems across the country stopped doing trials, stopped doing anything but emergency proceedings during the time of the pandemic. So that would also have contributed to fewer people coming into the prison system. The test will be once more of the systems open up, whether in fact those numbers hold or whether we see another influx in. But as people like Professor Tony Doob have pointed out, in any given year, there are approximately 5,000 people who go into prisons, federal penitentiaries, and go out of prisons. And so the fact that we have seen far fewer than those coming in and out during this time, the fact that we know that there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 to 3,000 people during this time of this pandemic who would have been eligible for release into the community, either because their sentence ended or because they were eligible for conditional release on parole or temporary absences or work releases. And those numbers haven't happened. tells us a very important story. And it's part of the reason health professionals were speaking out as well. So I think going forward, one of the obvious questions is what can we do from here? And I would encourage, and we have been encouraging members of the public who are concerned about this, not just from a perspective of prisoners' concerns, but also an overall public health. These are individuals who, by and large, are from our community, return to our communities. Do we want them to be in a situation where, without access to program services, living in isolation, with all the consequent negative impacts those can have on those individuals, coming back into our community in a way that in fact puts their ability to contribute, to integrate into the community at risk? Do we want that for our communities as a whole? And of course, in a broader context, is that the kind of humane or inhumane, more to the point, types of approaches we want to see in our names? And I think the answer for most of us is no, that not just the health, the drain this will cause to our health systems, but I think taking instruction from many of the calls that are being made right now to, when I hear defund the police, what I actually hear from people is we have now generations, certainly decades, and I would say centuries of policy making that has privileged the use of force, the use of containment, and not really encouraged us to look at why is it that our jails are full of poor people, racialized people, people with mental health issues, people who have been on the margins in large part because of policy decisions we have taken to privilege those who have more resources and power and authority, white skin privilege and the like. And so I think we have an opportunity now to say, let's rethink how we govern. Let's rethink how we set laws. Let's rethink how we allocate resources. And part of the reason, as Anita mentioned, that well, she didn't mention this part, but part of the reason, in fact, when I was approached about the Senate, that I agreed to even consider the possibility is because part of our role as senators is to look at the long-term interests of Canadians and to represent those, the term is often used, minorities. I consider that to be the people who often don't have a voice in electoral politics or aren't, whose voices often aren't heard. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do this was not just to work on issues related to prisoners, which of course is part of what I've done most of my life, but part of the reason I did that work is because it really is emblematic of when we fail at every other part of the system, our economic, our social, our health system. And so part of the reason we're working on guaranteed livable income and looking at shoring up or creating, and some would say we've long since ripped apart our social, economic, and health safety nets, but really about shoring those up. And I see guaranteed livable income as just part of that. And so anybody who's interested in these issues, and I know I'm talking to all of you who are already very, very much interested and active in these areas, I think now is the time to be letting your elected officials, to be letting the Prime Minister's office, to be letting Minister Morneau's office know that you want to see the types of services, the new approach that needs to be taken. The time is now to implement it, because what the pandemic has laid bare is exactly those levels of inequality, and what we have the opportunity to do now is to rebuild in a way that actually remedies some of those areas. And we've got lots of examples of how to do that, with whether we go back to the work that was done by Murray Sinclair when he did the Manitoba Justice Inquiry, whether we look at the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women calls for justice, whether we look at the incredible work of the Law Reform Commission, whether we, look at your own member, Irwin Waller's work on how do we actually shore up the resources so we prevent more people from being in situations where they are marginalized, victimized, criminalized, and institutionalized. So those are some of my thoughts. I look forward to your suggestions as to what else we could be doing. We are sitting this coming week, and I think many of us are trying to figure out how best to move these issues forward in the most productive way without continuing to leave people behind. So any and all suggestions, comments, criticisms, I welcome. So thank you very much. I'm not sure if my timer didn't go off, so it looks like I came in just under a couple of minutes, but I'm happy to pass that to you. Oops.
We're just waiting for Anita to unmute.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, I'm not muted now. So anybody who wants to ask question, if you could send it, you can do that with the chat button. That would be good. So if you have questions to Senator Kim Pate, please ask them now. And yeah, it's.
Well, maybe while I see you posted, I'm not sure if it was Anita or Andrew or Irwin posted, the office sent 2 bills that we're working on that some of you I know have been incredibly instrumental in promoting in the community. The bill that was first started, that was inspired by the work of Irwin Kotler, which is the bill to allow judges the discretion to not impose mandatory minimum sentences. I introduced that in February again for the second time. It's another one that may have an opportunity to get through if in fact there's interest in it, and then one to allow criminal records convictions to expire rather than people having to apply for it and go through the bureaucratic process, but also the cost of that is now, when you count everything in, the $631 fee. Well, actually, I think it's already gone up to $644, and plus all the costs of getting fingerprints and other records. It's now closer to $1,000, which you can imagine is out of reach for most people to be able to get a criminal record conviction expunged. So those are 2, and then the guaranteed livable income work that we've been doing.
Okay, here are some questions.
Okay.
What can First Unitarian do to tackle the problems of poor, racialized, indigenous, and mentally ill, and in addition, guaranteed livable income?
Well, I think that you already do a lot of work in that area on the ground. I do think sending a message to the government that you want to see some different policy directions and that you support some of these kinds of initiatives that are being put forth. My understanding is that there are a lot of people within the government, within the House of Commons, and certainly, as you may know, there were 50 senators who wrote in support of transfer, basically taking the CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and moving that to a kind of guaranteed livable income. So there are a number of people already supportive. The folks who need to be convinced apparently are the Minister of Finance and obviously the rest of Cabinet. So any efforts you can bring there, I think, would be helpful. I think also the efforts to look at how do we breathe life into some of the recommendations that have been made about really undoing the militarization of the police and corrections in this country would be really valuable, and to insist on the resourcing. It really, post 9/11 in this country, we saw that ramping up of munitions and weaponry and power that have resulted in some of the abuses of authority and power that we've seen, and the deaths of people, particularly Indigenous and Black people in the last months, including in this country. And so I think some of those efforts would be very, 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 very helpful.
And asked also for you to talk more about defund police.
Well, when I hear defund police, I mean, I've been speaking with a number of my colleagues who want to, have been working on, particularly with First Nations, on the issues of self-governance and the desire to see Indigenous communities be able to basically develop their own supports and resources for, whether some of them don't call it policing, but essentially policing. And many of you will be familiar with groups like Bear Patrol in Manitoba and other places. In fact, in Toronto, there's a Bear Patrol now. And these are Indigenous people who have taken it upon themselves to provide supports and respond to crises, because horrifically, in many communities, even when they're in crisis and in fear of their own protection, will not call upon the police for fear of a greater problem if they call the police, and greater harm to their community if in fact they invoke the police. So really talking about insisting on those resources being placed in the community. Some people have, in some of the housing, public housing areas, people have talked about going back to community policing, but not in the way of just having a community police center in or an office set up in a community in the ways that community policing was interpreted a couple of decades ago, but really the historical idea of where COP came from, citizen on patrol, that it's really someone who lives in the community, knows the community, and supports the community, not someone who comes from outside and wields power and control in a way that can be, as we've seen, incredibly destructive sometimes. And so really looking at how do we invest the resources that have been put into massive, like that armored vehicle that was in the news just this past week that was going into Halifax. Instead of having those sorts of resources, what about supports for people who are on the street, housing strategies? What about addiction supports? What about the kinds of assistance that people need on the ground every day that they're not getting? Assisting with food security for those who are in situations where they don't have that, whether it's because they're in northern communities or they're in such dense, overcrowded, poor communities that they don't have the kinds of supports they need. So really it's about reallocating resources. In my mind, it's about reallocating resources and ensuring that those supports are in place. And what we know from, Irwin can, talk more about this because he's done tons of work in this, is that if you invest early in those sorts of ways, you actually reduce the likelihood of people being in situations where they're more likely to be victimized or criminalized going forward.
Okay, somebody also wants you to talk more about the Guaranteed Income Initiative.
Okay. Now, I don't know, did we send the, I'm terrible at technology. I'm a total techno-twit, so I can't see exactly what we sent. But we have a perspectives document, and we call it the VB 604. And we had to put a footnote because people said, "What does that mean?" Well, VB just means Victoria Building Room 604, which is our office, because we. And what we tried to do is talk about the fact that there are a number of models that have been put out, and when you say I tend to use the term guaranteed livable income because I want a livable income, not just an income that would keep people in poverty. I do not want a universal income. I don't want everybody to get the same amount of money. Because as people like Art Eggleton, who was one of the first proponents of these sorts of approaches in the Senate, along with Hugh Siegel, has pointed out, he used to be an accountant, or I guess he's always, if you're once an accountant, are you always an accountant? I don't know. Anyway, he was an accountant, and he said he spent a lot of time trying to help rich people keep all their money. And so they're giving a universal income to everybody means that some people who least need it might actually get it, and it costs a lot more to do that. And instead, so we're talking about an income that would be universally accessible, much like our health system is supposed to be, so that when you're in need, as we've seen in these current situations, many people have been in need, you can access the resources. And I would see it personally as potentially replacing social assistance. Some of you have heard me speak about what I consider the criminally low social assistance rates in this country. There is no province or territory in this country where people can survive on the money that's provided through social assistance. And so we have created an infinitely criminalizable group, in my view, because not everybody gets criminalized, but many do, in large part because they're trying to negotiate that poverty in ways that, if it's known, depending on how they do it, what avenues they use to try and to negotiate that poverty, they can end up, and too many end up criminalized, for carrying packages or drugs or whatever. And so we're talking about an income that allows people a leg up and out of poverty. And I found it very, very interesting that the government very quickly seized on people need at least $2,000 a month. There is nowhere in this country, nowhere, that there are those kinds of resources made available to poor people. And yet those resources were made available to people who had lost their jobs, who already, regardless of whether they had all kinds of other means. And so, yes, an income testing, I think an income testing is appropriate, but not a means testing, which in my view has led to incredibly judgmental and sometimes quite mean-spirited approaches, and certainly the stigma of being poor has impacted how people have been eligible or not eligible for for social assistance resources. And I do think we need to look at some of the subsidies and the ways in which we have provided tax havens and exemptions for the very wealthy and for corporations. And so if you look at the document, we've tried to do a couple of things, try and myth bust the usual that, oh, well, if you do this, everybody will just stay home and nobody will work. In fact, there is no evidence of that anywhere. Certainly not in the examples that were done in Ontario or in Manitoba. And in fact, quite the opposite. What we see is that the only people who stay home more, if you will, are people trying to get an education or retraining, or taking care of people, whether it's their children, their parents, their people with disabilities and their families. And in fact, there's no evidence that in fact it creates communities of layabouts, quite the opposite. And so I think we should be looking at these sorts of approaches. Oh, and the other is for the amount that may require some extra taxes. Personally, I would like to pay, this may sound, even when I was in the nonprofit sector, I would say I would like to pay more taxes if I know those taxes are going to those who most are in need and most, that will actually prop up the entire population in a different way. And so I think the end amount that the Parliamentary Budget Office figures showed was it maybe about $10 to $12 billion would need to come through taxes. But the point is, all of that money would be going back into people's pockets, not into corporations or into it would all be going back into people's pockets, because that money would be going to assist other people to be able to live and contribute to the community. And what we know from countries where they have tried some of this is that the the social capital index, if you will, the happiness index, the manner in which people, the mental health of people, the overall physical health of people improves. And so what we haven't seen costed in any of these, and we're proposing should be looked at, is that the impact this has on our health systems. And those of you know the work of Evelyn Forget know that was a big part of why she even looked at this area. Is she saw people coming into emergency rooms with conditions that if they had enough money to buy the food that they, healthy food, if they had enough money to be able to have access to some of the recreation and other lifestyle opportunities, if they even had the money to buy the medicine they needed, that we would see far fewer people with some of the chronic long-standing health conditions like diabetes and heart conditions and respiratory ailments that people have. And so the cost savings hasn't even been calculated, not to mention the criminal legal system and what we would save there if people weren't put in situations of being in abject poverty. And so those are some of the areas that we've been looking at as well, and really encouraging that we invest there and invest soon. We've also suggested that we not do another pilot. Forget pilots. What we need now is a program. We need to move forward with a national program. And anybody who says you can't do it just has to look at what we've been able to do during the pandemic. The CERB, the wage subsidies, all show that we can actually do it. It requires the political will, and here again is an opportunity for all of you to participate in that and letting the government know that there is the public interest, and therefore push them to be the political will. I shouldn't say them, I'm now part of it, but all of us to ensure that these sorts of approaches are implemented.
Okay, thank you. There are lots of questions coming in now.
Okay, great.
Do you, Senator Pate, see any significant progress in the area of corrections reforms since the Liberals took over the government in 2015? And if so, what changes are underway or in the works?
Well, I wish I could say yes. I think that there are many individuals who want to see significant change within the, not just the prison, but policing and those areas. I do think we have some significant challenges in the sense that the power and much of the policy making in those areas has essentially been relegated to police associations and guards unions, not just in Canada, but around the world. And a real challenge is going to be to say, how to I'll say people like me who have long supported labor movements, really look at how, in fact, these bodies have become less about labor protection and more about solidifying and limiting outside scrutiny, transparency, accountability. Because I'm just dealing with a number of situations now of, for instance, women who've experienced sexual assault, both staff and prisoners within the prison settings. And many of the women went to their union requesting support. And some of the folks who first encouraged me to have my name stand for the Senate were women who had experienced similar situations in policing. And so when we know that those bodies have become much more about entrenching male, white privilege, then we should be looking at what do we have to do to challenge them. And I'm quite frankly, we haven't figured that out yet. And so any suggestions any of you have of how to continue to challenge that, some of us have been recommending, I'm one of them, that we take up the recommendation that Louise Arbour made 24 years ago when she looked at the situation at the prison for women in Kingston and recommended judicial oversight, that we actually have the courts have to oversee these sorts of behaviors. I think that's one way. I think other ways are to insist, as we were talking earlier, about the idea that the community has, that policing and correctional authorities have a responsibility to the community, that they cannot remain the kind of closed, isolated environments. We used to refer to the wardens before the charter, and even after the charter. One of the challenges is that and again, Louise Arbour said it best. She said that while the rule of law was supposed to be within prisons, and I would say within policing, that often it's very difficult that there's rules everywhere, but very difficult to discern the rule of law because the lack of accountability. And we used to refer to wardens as essentially the kings of their fiefdoms, that in fact, when we were doing some human rights training with prisoners and law students over the last 20 years, we used to have a little exercise that one of the law students came up with, which we'd be in the prisons and we'd ask folks to say, put in order who has the authority to make decisions. And we'd have, the charter, we'd have the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, we'd have the Human Rights Commission, and one of them was the warden. In the first few years that we did that exercise, in every single prison, every single prisoner put the warden as the top decision maker. Now that told us volumes. The warden was supposed to be following all of the rules, the charter, implementing, not interfering with it. And so it spoke volumes about that. Now, in some prisons that would still be the case, but in the ones that we then were doing human rights and legal training that the law students were engaged in, they would know the difference now, and it has been part of why we're seeing some of the challenges coming out of prisons, I think, but we need more of that. And so we really need to push for those reforms. We also need to challenge, I think, our own thinking. When I say our own thinking, that, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, you did something wrong, people say, oh, if you're bad, we'll call the police and you'll go to jail. I think we need to undo those kinds of narratives as well, because the idea that the jails are only full of people who've done something wrong, I mean, as we get older, we realize there's a whole lot of people who've done a whole lot of things wrong. In fact, most of us, by the time we reach the age of majority, have done something for which we could have been criminalized if it was known, depending on who we did it to, if it was reported, on and on. And so we don't do those kinds of self-reports, or at least I don't think we do. Erwin, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen those kinds of self-report studies done for years and years that show that most of us are doing things that could be considered criminal acts. And yet we all can name people in senior positions, either politicians or people, teachers, lawyers, doctors, people who have done things that could have been criminalized but weren't, whether it's because the privileges they had, it wasn't reported, or if it was reported, even if they were charged, if they had a lawyer, if they could fight it out in the system, and on and on. And so I think we have to undo those stigmas that it's only those who have really done wrong who end up in prison. We know that, in fact, it's those who are most disadvantaged, and increasingly our prisons have become surrogates for homeless shelters, for homes for battered women, for treatment centers, and they shouldn't be being used as the catch-all for every other system that fails.
Okay, now what is your opinion of body cameras on police?
Well, body cameras can be turned on and off just as easily as other cameras. And so I do think there are a lot of people supporting body cameras. I think if that was the only policy decision taken, that would be a huge travesty. I think we have opportunities to do much more than that. That doesn't mean I don't think we should be monitoring what people do, but if we have the kind of resources and supports for people in the community, then body cameras are after the fact confirming what we already know is happening. We know that there are discriminatory attitudes taken in what gets reported, what gets dealt with, how people are dealt with. So rather than invest in a whole bunch of body cameras, personally, I would like to see those resources divested to the community. But that's just, you know, if we do nothing else, then I suppose body cameras would at least give us better evidence after the fact.
Okay, here's another one. We are paying more and more for police and less for mental crisis workers. Can the Senate raise awareness of what is cost effective and humane ways of dealing with these problems instead of police?
Mm-hmm. I do think, I mean, one of the things that we were trying to do through the Senate, the Human Rights Committee, and the study of the human rights of prisoners was actually talk about how we need to reallocate those resources. And a number of us have been speaking about the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals as the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a marker, Irvin likes that, as a way to be proceeding instead of looking at some of the approaches we're taking. So I think, again, a message to all of us encouraging us to take those sorts of approaches could not hurt. I mean, I could see a message coming from either you individually or as a congregation to every MP and senator urging us to take more proactive approaches. You know, so I think those are incredibly important messages. And too often we hear from folks, you know, who are challenging us to do something less progressive, let's put it that way. So.
Okay, part of the overall problem of poverty is lack of affordable housing. What is being done at the federal level to increase the supply of affordable housing?
Well, I know that there's a housing strategy that, and you know, we've had anti-poverty strategy. There's an anti-poverty. You may be aware there's an anti-poverty caucus. That's another group to write to. Nate Erskine-Smith and I are loosely co-chairing it. It's across both chambers, the House of Commons and the Senate, and we have long advocated. Well, I think it was initiated, actually, it was before my time, but I think it was initiated in 1989 when the resolution to end child poverty was implemented. And so we absolutely need to be pushing on those strategies. And I know Leilani Farha from here in Ottawa was the special rapporteur and has been doing an incredible amount of work on that. And I think yes, continuing to push on those fronts is important as well. I do think we're in a moment that people rising up to, to basically make sure your voices are heard about what we want to see done differently in this country and in this, in this municipality as well as this province is vitally important. Because too often, some of us are being told, oh, that's your, well, you came from that sector. Of course, you've got these kinds of weird and wonderful positions, Kim, but that's not necessarily shared by others. And I actually know that's not true. But I also know, and this is not to be, please don't hear me as saying I think it's on anybody else to be raising it. I think it's our responsibility to be raising it. But it's also always helpful to have, to be able to draw on the experiences of folks who are also sharing those opinions and not be relying on those who are most adversely impacted. What I mean by that is some of you have heard me speak about these issues and the expectation that it's going to be poor people to rise up to reform social assistance. Given the stigma that's attached, given the risk that that poses to people's economic livelihood, limited as it is on social assistance, we can't expect that. I think it's irresponsible to say it's got to be all those individuals standing up. But those of us who have more relative privilege and opportunity and have a voice to say it, I think it is our responsibility to speak up. So that's all I'm saying. So I'm not asking anybody to put themselves in any kind of jeopardy. If you're amongst those who are at risk, please do not put yourself at further risk.
Okay, now that the senators are no longer part of the party caucus, does that give you more freedom to pursue areas of particular interest to you? Or does it lessen your voice, preventing you from speaking with authority on behalf of your party?
Well, I was never involved in party politics. I'd been asked to run for several different parties, and my joke always was, I always said, you know, you want me now, but the first vote that I refuse to follow party lines, you'll kick me out of caucus. And so so I think it's both, actually. There's a freedom, but you know, I often say, if you never played team sports, and that's, you know, a more privileged position. I was you know, I ran and I was on the swim team when I was younger. But if you don't actually know how to communicate and develop consensus, then you could have the greatest idea in the world and it won't go anywhere. And so one of the challenges, I think, right now is we have the Parliament of Canada Act that presumes a partisan approach, and then we have 4 bodies within the Senate, 4 groups, one of which is partisan, 3 of which, you know, one calls themselves a Progressive Senators Group, the other is the Canadian Senators Group, and the other is the Independent Senators Group. But all are trying to move things along, and if you don't have a relative consensus, then the ability to move things through are incredibly problematic. And in fact, this morning and last night and next week, I've been working on what I want to say in response to an inquiry that Senator Lillian Dick launched a year ago after some senators shut down our discussion of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples at the Aboriginal Peoples Committee. And so, and I want to, so any ideas any of you have, send them in, because I'm literally working on, you know, I've had to learn to say things in 2-minute, 3-minute, 5-minute, 10-minute to 15-minute bites. And, you know, I'm trying to draw the parallel between what she faced in that moment as she was bombarded with all kinds of procedural games to try and shut us down, and they almost succeeded. And as you know, they ultimately did succeed on the floor of the Senate to stop us voting on the UN Declaration. But to draw the parallels between that moment is, and even when there's broad consensus that we need to be doing something, there are procedural games that can be played that can stop us moving forward. And we have not succeeded yet in changing those rules, and we need to. Those who've been following the situation with Senator Lynn Bayak, I mean, that whole situation came in part as a response to my first speech in the Senate. My first speech was on the overrepresentation of Indigenous women in prisons, and Senator Bayak spoke to that inquiry and basically said, you know, so lots of good things came out of residential schools, is in my humble opinion the gross summary of that. That led to what I understand to be a whole barrage of mail coming to her, most of which was not in support of what she said. Most of it was challenging what she said. In fact, I'm told about 80 to 90% of the letters were challenging what she said. She ended up posting on her Senate-sponsored website letters that supported her position, and that led to a number of us challenging and recommending that at the very least her Senate server be taken down. Ultimately, as you know, she's suspended at the moment, and what we see though is very real challenges about how do we actually ensure that senators that we ourselves demonstrate the type of behavior we expect to have in the Senate. And so that's a bit about what I'm writing and trying to challenge us this week to step up and literally take action, but also live and work in the ways that we expect that we should be modeling for other folks, given our incredible level of privilege and opportunity and positions.
Anita, we have just time for one more question before ending the recording. and going into gallery view.
Okay, how can we raise awareness among faith leaders about something other than punishment as a response to violence?
Well, I would defer to some of you on this, except to say that in, again, the guaranteed livable income issue, as you will know, it was Catholic and a number of Anglican, anyway, a number of faith leaders also wrote in support of a guaranteed livable income, which tells me that we're already, if not halfway, at least partway there, because you don't support a guaranteed livable income if you don't also recognize the discriminatory issues that exist in society more broadly than income. And so I think we can be calling out faith leaders to encourage them to speak out and to challenge, in fact, what is happening, you know, in a number of spheres in our communities and society right now. So, if any of us can assist with that, if we, you know, I certainly had discussions with some of the. Now I'm going to show my ignorance of levels, but bishops and archbishops and folks who wanted to hear about some of these issues, and so I think we're already on our way there. And for many people, I'm also hearing from folks, well, we don't know what to do, you know, and so many of us have ideas about what we could be doing, and so I think sharing those and encouraging people to speak up, and so that we can all collectively move forward is really, really crucial at this time.